Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to our pre-film lecture. Let's jump in and get started. We're looking at New Hollywood or the American New Wave. Now that is a film movement. More specifically, we're going to take a look at one particular film in that movement called The Graduate. And the reason I chose The Graduate is because it is a very rich film in terms of visual language. It developed some very innovative styles, and it was a very fresh, radical film at the time that it came out. It's still a very relevant film. So, to give you some context, we're going to look at when the film came out. And the film came out in 1967, so we're looking here at a time in history, a time in cinema history that is known as New Hollywood. Hollywood was going through some birthing pangs. A new kind of Hollywood was being born. Another term that is used to describe this movement is called the American New Wave. Let's jump into what New Hollywood is. Hollywood is somewhere in between Old Hollywood, because it's still Hollywood, but also it borrowed a lot of stylistic tropes, a lot of innovative techniques and approaches, a real spirit of revolution and radicalism in terms of filmmaking from the French New Wave. Now, we will talk about the French New Wave later in the semester. An important term you're going to need to know this semester is called auteur theory. Again, it's called auteur theory, like auteur. This theory basically argues that the director, as an artist, brings the full force of his or her style to bear on the film. He or she is not just someone who's hired to crank out the material. The French New Wave approached film and said, look, each film is unique if the director has his or her vision and imprints his or her style on the movie. You notice who the filmmaker is based on the way the film is made. Now, this was a radical departure from the way films had been made or perceived earlier in the century. From the early birth of cinema in the late 1800s, right, and then the birth of the studios in the 1910s, up until the 50s, film directors were considered to be important people, absolutely important people, but they weren't considered to be visionaries. They weren't considered artists. They weren't considered someone who was providing their own vision, their own statement. That changed with the French New Wave. So now, since Hollywood was borrowing this idea, Hollywood started to see its directors as the superstar. And that's auteur theory. So you've got Lucas, you've got Spielberg, you've got Scorsese, you've got Mike Nichols, you've got Francis Ford Coppola. All of these names now, they're not just directors who are hired to direct. No, they are visionaries. The New Hollywood directors created new forms of cinematic language. Now, they didn't fully create them because they borrowed them from the French, but they took them and they ran with them. They were educated in film school, or they had studied film theory. So these are not people who worked their way up through the system. And what they did was they tweaked existing techniques to create, or to realize might be a better term, their own vision. So they took they took everything they knew because they studied in film school. So they knew all the techniques of visual language, and then they used them to tweak them. They changed them. They personalized them. They made them their own. Another important aspect of the New Hollywood directors is that they dealt with important issues of the day. They were dealing with issues that had to do with the world around them socially, the world around them politically, and they tended to be on the more rebellious side. They were young, they were anti-establishment. Nixon was president from 1968 to 75. They were really against Nixon. They were even at some point against Lyndon Johnson because of the war in Vietnam, okay, and against Nixon for expanding that war and not winding it down. So these were filmmakers with an agenda. They had something to say, and they wanted to say it, and they were going to say it. And they did. And all of these elements, film school, new techniques, social and political issues, resulted in a movement that we call New Hollywood. The storylines that they emphasize are things that you wouldn't typically expect Hollywood films to be about. Okay? For one thing, the story structure tended to be nonlinear. That means the stories weren't told from A to Z in the order that they happened. They might jump around a lot. They were curveball endings, endings that left you scratching your head, endings that didn't resolve things, endings that left you going, what? That's how it's ending, right? So they ended things in a not necessarily a satisfactory way, and in a way that wasn't very satisfying. They blended genres. Okay, they might take a Western and turn it into a social political statement, like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. So they blended genres, they blended characters. Sometimes the main character wasn't necessarily a hero. Sometimes the main character was unsympathetic, or a nebbish, like in this film, or an antagonist, or a criminal. They blurred the lines between the protagonist, which basically means the so-called hero of the story, and the antagonist, the person who is standing in his or her way. So this is our film, The Graduate. This is one of the original movie posters, and as you can see, it won Mike Nichols an Oscar for Best Director. It created tremendous waves when it came out. Theater lines ran around the block. 500, 600 seat movie houses in New York City were sold out. People would go see it again and again and again. As you will discover in your reading, this is an important film. But I don't want you to take, my word for it in the sense that we're going to watch it just because it was important back then. I want to make this film relevant to us today, and I want you to determine just how relevant it is to you in your life, and how you interpret the film through your own personal lens. A brief introduction here. We'll just do three more slides, and then we'll let you watch the film. So we're looking here at The Graduate, and essentially this is a story that is a story of a loss of innocence. This is a story of Benjamin Braddock. He's a young man. He has just graduated school, and he's flying back, presumably from the East Coast, back to LA. Okay, we see him in the first shots of the film. We see him in a plane, and then in the airport, and at the luggage rack, and he's going home. Okay, he's just graduated. He belongs to an upper middle class family. He lives someplace near Beverly Hills. It looks like in West LA. So he comes from a pretty well-off background. Now, the thing about Benjamin Braddock is, as the director said, he is a young man fighting, doing anything not to be sucked into the middle class. He doesn't want to be like his parents. His aspiration in life is not to have a home like his parents and a Jaguar in the driveway, right? He's just not interested in that kind of life. He's struggling against that. The problem is he doesn't really have the tools to do it. The film deals with these kinds of themes. Okay, now what is a theme? A theme is what a film is really about, or a book, or a poem, right, or a play. But for our purposes, what is the film really about? Nobody in the movie says isolation. Nobody in the movie uses the word alienation, rebellion, dissociation, or barrenness. But the movie is all about those things. Isolation, being alone, feeling alone. Alienation, not feeling connected to the people or the society, the culture, your religion, your nationality, your neighborhood. You just feel like you don't belong. That's alienation. Rebellion takes a step farther, doing something about it, doing something that might be frowned upon. Dissociation is the opposite of association. If you associate with someone, you familiarize yourself with them. You hang out with them. If you dissociate, you separate yourself. You don't identify. And barrenness means lack of fertility, lack of anything the ability for anything to grow. So this is what the movie is about, and his mind, his behavior is all about these ideas. Let's take a look at some examples. I want you to think about this when you watch the movie, since he's the main character. Is what kind of hero is he? Okay. Is he a hero? If so, what kind of a hero? Here's what I really want you to think about. What does he stand for? What does he fight for? I'm playing a game, a grown-up game, I don't know the rules to. Right? He feels lost. He doesn't feel ready for the adult world. He doesn't want to be an adult. He doesn't identify with adult values, especially back in 1967. 1967, the war in Vietnam was heating up, and all young men had to register for the selective service, and if their number came up, they were registered for the draft. They were drafted. Okay. Now, you didn't have to be drafted if you could go to college. Does that seem fair? No, it wasn't. Okay. Now, it could be possible that if enough draftees were needed, that they would start drafting college students. But if you're rich enough and fortunate enough to be a Benjamin Braddock with parents who have a really nice car and a driveway and in a house at the time that would have been worth the equivalent of a couple of $1 million, then you go to college, right? And you don't get drafted. So he's not really grown up. Okay, he's not really grown up. He doesn't really realize how lucky he is that he didn't have to go to Vietnam. But now he's graduated in Vietnam, and everyone who's in Vietnam feels very far away in this film, except for moments which we'll see when he goes to Berkeley. Okay, and there's concern there about agitators who are basically protesters who are protesting the war and protesting the draft, which I mentioned right there. Okay, so he is not an agitator. In fact, he's the farthest thing from an agitator unless he's a passive agitator. Now, I'm going to be real careful here in all the films. I will not spoil the movie for you. We're going to just define some terms here. One is motifs. A motif can be a visual representation of a theme, but it can also be an audio representation of a theme. And what does that mean? Okay, I'll give you an example. Water. Okay, if there's a lot of water in this film, that it becomes a motif, and the question is what does the water mean? We see it again and again, and we'll talk about it after you've watched the movie. So water and glass play a strong visual and thematic role in the film. I want you to ask yourself, what does the water mean? You'll see it right from the very beginning of the movie. You'll also notice that in a lot of places where Benjamin is, see if you pay attention and notice, you're going to see lots of prison-like bars, slats, Venetians. Even in this shot, you see he's in the corner here, and there are slats, Venetian slats behind him. So what did we just establish? We just established that the visual representations of a theme. So the theme, again, is isolation and alienation. Water, glass, reflections, prison-like slats, Venetian blinds, all convey those ideas. So a motif is a recurring theme. Another important theme is materialism. Materialism. Benjamin takes that totally for granted, and he doesn't identify with it, and he rejects it. He sees life as having more meaning than just things and money. It's beyond that. He doesn't know what, but he knows that there is greater meaning. He just doesn't have a clue what it is. And so in the film, Mike Nichols says, in the commentary, the director says that Benjamin is an object. You notice in the opening shots of the movie how he looks like an object. He's drowning in objects. He's surrounded by people who are value things. And so he's like a conveyor belt. He's on the conveyor belt like his luggage. In the opening shots of the film, you're just going to see him on this conveyor belt, and you're going to see his suitcase on the conveyor belt. It's just kind of making that visual equivalence. So what is visual language? Now, this is important to know because this is essentially what our course is ultimately about. What our course is ultimately about is how do movies communicate to us beyond just through dialogue? Visual language is the ability of a film or television show to communicate information to the audience through a combination of visual and audio methods that do not simply rely on a character explaining something. Oh, it's hot in here. Okay, that's a character explaining something. But getting a shot of a thermometer and then panning over to someone whose face is red like a lobster and sweating with sweat around his collar. You see the difference? Man, it's hot in here. That's not visual language, right? We don't go to the movies to watch people say things. We go to the movies to feel what they feel and to understand it through sight and sound. So we see the thermometer, it's at 95 degrees, and we pan over and we see our character, and he looks like he's in a sauna. Okay, we know he's hot. He doesn't have to say it. That's an example of visual language. It's how do movies communicate to us? How do they make us feel things? When a character does say something dumb like, it's hot in here, when a character says something that is either unnecessary or obvious, that's called exposition. Okay? It's information we need to know. But the worst way to communicate exposition is when a character just says something. Visual language uses, as we talked about last week, cinematography. Okay? Camera and lighting. I just picked two random examples that we need to know this week. Shot size. Okay, is it a wide shot? Is it a close-up? Is it a medium shot? Again, what are those things? It's just how much we can see in the shot. If we can see a lot, then it's wide. If we can only see someone's face, then it's a close-up. It makes a difference whether we see someone from a distance or we see them in the context of a room and they look small, or if we see them really, really close up. Another important term in cinematography is a focus rack. Now, I've chosen these because they're relevant to this film, but that just means when the camera changes focus from one subject to someone else. So we're shifting focus. Okay? We don't move the camera. Editing. Okay? How we cut, when we cut. Jump cuts are an important term that we're going to learn this week. A jump cut is a non-continuous cut. It's when you cut from one person in a shot, and then it's just suddenly later, and that same person's in the shot. And that's a jump cut. It's a cut that doesn't show continuity. Another example of editing are flash frames. We're going to see flash frames in this film. We're going to see shots that appear for just a quick moment. Flash, right? Shots that appear for a quick moment and then go away, maybe several times. That's designed to communicate something. The question is what? So we have cinematography, we have editing, we have visual narrative techniques, so we have story, and we've already talked about motifs. Characters, the actual characters in the film, the actors, you could call them. I prefer characters, but what they do and how they do it conveys information, doesn't it? Their body language, their reactions, their tone of voice, their expressions, all of that communicates information non-verbally. And finally, sound, which is a whole new world, right? We have music, we have silence, which is powerful, and we have sound effects. And you combine these three in any different way, in any different scene, and it will convey different information. Now, on that note, we're going to stop. Go ahead and watch the film, enjoy it, and I will see you on the other side of the film when you have finished watching it, and we'll talk about the movie.